The morning air over Yugoslavia hangs cold and still on November 7th, 1944. The kind of crystalline autumn dawn where visibility extends for miles and aircraft contrails etch white lines across pale blue sky. Captain William Rooney guides his P-38 Lightning northward from Italian bases, flying alone on a photo reconnaissance mission over Niš, deep in territory where Soviet forces have recently liberated the city from German occupation. The twin-engine fighter carries no bombs, minimal ammunition, weight stripped away to accommodate cameras in the nose, and extra fuel for the long flight home. Soviet liaison officers in Italy had assured American commanders that their aircraft would be recognized as allies, that identification procedures were clear, that there would be no incidents. Rooney carries recognition flares, has memorized the radio frequencies for Allied identification, knows the specific routing that should keep him clear of areas where Soviet fighters patrol. None of it will matter. The 9 Yakovlev Yak-3 fighters that rise from Niš airfield to intercept him are not interested in identification protocols or Allied cooperation agreements. They see an aircraft that resembles the Luftwaffe's twin-engine fighters, operating in airspace they control, and they are coming to kill him. What happens in the next 12 minutes will challenge everything Soviet tactical doctrine teaches about air combat superiority, will demonstrate a maneuver American pilots call going compressible, that Soviet training says is suicidal, and will force a lone reconnaissance pilot to execute what his own squadron mates have mocked as an impossible trick that trades certain death for probable death, and somehow delivers neither. To understand the desperation of Rooney's situation as 9 Soviet fighters close on his position, one must first comprehend the tactical mathematics that governed air combat in 1944. The Yak-3 was among the most capable fighters produced by any nation during the war, lightweight, highly maneuverable, capable of exceptional performance below 15,000 feet, where most Eastern Front combat occurred. Soviet pilots flying Yak-3s had destroyed hundreds of German aircraft, had earned the respect even of Luftwaffe veterans who acknowledged the type's superiority in turning combat. 9 Yak-3s against a single P-38, especially a reconnaissance-configured P-38 stripped of armor and heavy weapons, represented not a fight, but an execution. Standard doctrine for the outnumbered pilot was clear: run if faster, climb if able, dive if desperate. But understand that 9-to-1 odds were mathematically insurmountable. Soviet tactical theory, refined through years of brutal combat against the Luftwaffe, held that coordinated attacks by multiple fighters eliminated any possibility of escape. One fighter might miss, 2 might fail to achieve firing position, but 9 fighters attacking in sequence would inevitably succeed. The P-38 Lightning was not designed for the mission Rooney was flying, or the combat he was about to experience. Lockheed had created it as a high-altitude interceptor and long-range escort fighter, with twin engines providing reliability for oceanic crossings and high-mounted boom and rudder configuration, protecting pilots from engine failures. It was fast in level flight, could climb effectively, carried heavy armament when configured for combat. But it was not nimble. The aircraft's weight and unconventional design made it less maneuverable than single-engine fighters in traditional dogfighting. German and Japanese pilots had learned to force P-38s into turning combat, where their advantages in speed and firepower became irrelevant. The few P-38 pilots who had encountered Soviet fighters in the confused territorial overlaps of late 1944 reported that Yak-3s could outturn Lightnings easily, that trying to dogfight Soviet fighters was suicidal. The standard advice was unambiguous: if engaged by Soviet aircraft, do not turn. Do not climb. simply dive away at maximum speed and hope the Yaks could not follow. Rooney had learned a different technique, one that most P-38 pilots refused to attempt because it seemed to violate basic principles of controlled flight. The phenomenon was called compressibility, a behavior that occurred when aircraft approached the speed of sound in steep dives. At velocities around 500 miles per hour and climbing, air flowing over the wings began behaving strangely, creating shock waves that disrupted normal airflow patterns. Control surfaces became less effective, sometimes reversed their inputs. Pulling back on the stick might cause the nose to tuck further downward rather than rising. Aircraft could enter uncontrollable dives, could experience structural failure from aerodynamic forces that exceeded design limits, could kill pilots who pushed too far into this poorly understood regime. The official guidance from Lockheed and the Army Air Forces was explicit. Do not exceed dive speeds that risked compressibility effects. The P-38's manual specified maximum dive speeds well below the threshold where these phenomena occurred. Rooney had ignored those specifications repeatedly, had experimented during training flights with how the aircraft behaved at speeds the manual said were prohibited, had learned through experience that compressibility was not instant death, but rather a controllable condition if you understood what was happening and did not panic. The theory that made Rooney willing to attempt what others called impossible was straightforward, even if executing it terrified even him. If you dived a P-38 steep enough and fast enough, you could accelerate beyond the speed any pursuing fighter could match in the dive. The Yak-3, brilliant at low-altitude maneuvering, was not designed for high-speed dives and lacked the structural strength to follow a P-38 into compressible speeds. If Soviet pilots tried to follow, their lighter airframes would risk structural failure before reaching speeds the P-38 could tolerate. The problem was surviving the dive yourself. Compressibility made the aircraft difficult to control, made recovery uncertain, required pulling out at altitudes so low that any mistake meant impact with terrain. Squadron mates who had watched Rooney practice these dives during training told him he was insane, that he was going to kill himself, proving something that everyone already knew was impossible. The squadron commander had explicitly ordered him to stop, had threatened to ground him if he continued experimenting with techniques that violated established procedures. Rooney had agreed to follow orders, had stopped practicing the dives where observers could watch, and had continued refining the technique on solo flights, where no one would know what speeds he reached or how close to the ground he pulled out. The transformation from routine reconnaissance to desperate survival began at 09:17 hours when Rooney's aircraft was still 10 minutes from Nish, flying straight and level at 18,000 feet, while cameras in the nose recorded Soviet troop positions and supply lines. The radio crackled with Russian voices, urgent tones that needed no translation. Rooney checked his mirrors, saw nothing initially, then caught the glint of sunlight on canopies as 9 fighters climbed toward him from below, rising from Nish Airfield, where Soviet air defense had scrambled every available aircraft to intercept the unidentified twin-engine intruder. He reached for the recognition flares, prepared to fire the sequence that should identify him as Allied, but the approaching fighters were already maneuvering into attack positions, spreading into a formation that would allow them to engage sequentially, ensuring that when one fighter broke off, after firing another would be positioned to continue the attack. The mathematics were obvious. He could not outrun them in level flight, could not outclimb fighters already above him, could not fight 9 aircraft with the minimal ammunition his reconnaissance configuration carried. The manual said he should attempt radio contact, should try visual recognition procedures, should follow protocols that assumed both sides wanted to avoid friendly fire incidents. But the manual was written by people who had never been alone over hostile territory, with 9 fighters closing for the kill. The sound of his own engine note became the symbolic element that would define the next 12 minutes. The deep rumble of twin Allison engines that characterized the P-38's voice, a sound that would rise to a shriek as the aircraft accelerated beyond speeds its designers had intended, that would become a prayer and a threat simultaneously as Rooney pushed the Lightning into flight regimes where control became theoretical and survival became chance. That sound, familiar to every P-38 pilot but rarely heard at the intensities Rooney was about to experience, would transform from routine background noise into the audible manifestation of forces that could either save him or tear his aircraft apart. Soviet pilots closing on his position could not hear that sound, could not know what it represented, could not understand that the strange twin-engine fighter they were pursuing possessed capabilities their doctrine had not accounted for. The first Yak-3 opened fire at Euro 919, cannon rounds passing close enough that Rooney could see tracers arcing past his canopy. He pushed the control yoke forward, pointing the nose down, advancing throttles to maximum power while rolling inverted to increase dive angle. The altimeter unwound rapidly. 16,000 feet, 14,000, 12,000, while airspeed climbed through 300 miles per hour, 350, 400. The pursuing Yaks followed confidently, their pilots expecting the American to pull out soon, to trade altitude for speed, and then attempt to escape in level flight, where their numbers and maneuverability would tell. But Rooney did not pull out. At 450 miles per hour, he was approaching speeds where compressibility effects would begin, where the flight manual's red-lined maximum dive speed had already been exceeded, where Lockheed's engineers had explicitly warned that control could be lost. The Yaks were still following, still firing when opportunity presented, confident that the dive had to end soon, because no pilot would continue past the point where recovery became impossible. At 480 miles per hour, Rooney felt the first indications that normal aerodynamics were failing. The control yoke began buffeting in his hands, providing conflicting feedback as shock waves formed over the wings disrupted smooth airflow. The aircraft wanted to pitch nose down more steeply despite his neutral stick input, a tendency that would worsen as speed increased. Soviet fighters were falling behind now, their pilots recognizing that speeds were becoming dangerous, that their lighter aircraft could not safely follow into the dive regime where the P-38 was operating. The mathematics of pursuit had reversed. The fleeing aircraft was no longer trying to escape, but rather trying to survive, while pursuing aircraft were abandoning the chase to avoid structural failure. At 500 miles per hour, with altitude dropping through 6,000 feet and still diving, Rooney began the recovery procedure that most P-38 pilots believed was impossible. The technique required understanding what compressibility was doing to the aircraft and working with those forces rather than fighting them. Pull back on the yoke too aggressively, and the shock waves would make controls less effective, might cause the nose to tuck further down, might exceed structural limits and tear the tail off. The correct procedure was counterintuitive. Reduce power first. Deploy dive brakes if you had them. Rooney's reconnaissance bird did not. And then apply back pressure gradually, firmly but not violently, feeling for the moment when the shock waves began to dissipate and normal control authority returned. At 4,000 feet, still diving at nearly 500 miles per hour, Rooney began pulling back, feeling the aircraft resist, feeling G-forces build as the dive began flattening, feeling the airframe groan under loads it was never designed to experience. At 2,000 feet, the nose finally came level. At 1,500 feet, he was climbing slightly. At 1,000 feet, he rolled wings level and looked back to see where his pursuers were. The 9 Yak-3 fighters were scattered across the sky at various altitudes, some still descending to follow his dive, others pulling out early when they recognized the speeds were becoming unsafe, all of them now too far behind and too disorganized to re-engage effectively. Soviet pilots were radioing frantically, their voices sharp with confusion and frustration, reporting an encounter that their training had not prepared them for. The twin-engine American fighter had escaped not through superior speed in level flight. The Yaks were faster at low altitude, but through diving to speeds their aircraft could not match, through deliberately entering flight conditions that doctrine said were uncontrollable, through executing a recovery that should have resulted in structural failure or ground impact. The gun camera footage that Soviet pilots brought back to Nish would show the P-38 entering an impossibly steep dive, accelerating beyond any speed they had encountered, and somehow pulling out at an altitude so low that safety margins had been measured in feet rather than thousands of feet. Their flight instructors, watching that footage, would insist it was faked or that the pilot had been suicidal, because no rational aviator would deliberately fly that way. The resistance Rooney encountered when he returned to base reflected institutional disbelief that merged with institutional horror at the risks he had accepted. The intelligence debrief focused initially on what Soviet forces he had photographed, what troop movements he had documented, whether the reconnaissance mission had achieved its objectives. Then the questions shifted to the engagement with Soviet fighters, to how he had escaped, to the specifics of the dive and recovery. When Rooney described diving to compressible speeds and pulling out at under 2,000 feet, the debriefing officer stopped taking notes and asked him to repeat what he had said, certain he had misunderstood. The squadron commander, listening to the account, oscillated between relief that Rooney had survived and anger that he had used techniques explicitly prohibited. "You were ordered not to practice compressibility dives," the commander stated. "You violated those orders, endangered government property, and made survival depend on luck rather than proper procedures." Rooney's response was simple and unanswerable. The proper procedures would have resulted in his death. The prohibited technique had resulted in his survival, and sometimes luck was all you had when doctrine failed. The transformation in how the Army Air Forces understood P-38 capabilities following incidents like Rooney's escape was gradual and grudging. Officially, the compressibility diving technique remained prohibited, too dangerous to teach to average pilots, too likely to result in fatal accidents if attempted without extensive experience and precise understanding of the phenomenon. Unofficially, word spread through P-38 squadrons that extreme dives could provide escape options when other tactics failed, that the aircraft could survive compressible speeds if handled correctly, that official limits existed for good reasons but were not absolute barriers. Flight instructors began quietly discussing how to recognize compressibility on set, how to maintain control during recovery, what altitudes provided sufficient margin for error. The formal manual was not revised. Institutional conservatism and liability concerns prevented that. But informal knowledge accumulated, passed from experienced pilots to newer ones, creating a shadow curriculum that acknowledged what official doctrine could not. That survival sometimes required violating the rules designed to ensure survival. The 9 Soviet pilots who failed to intercept Rooney over Nish returned to their base confused and frustrated. reporting an engagement that seemed impossible according to their understanding of air combat dynamics. Their squadron commander reviewed the gun camera footage, consulted with technical specialists about whether American fighters possessed unknown performance capabilities, and filed reports that made their way through Soviet military channels. Those reports, examined by historians decades later after Soviet archives opened, reveal an interesting pattern. Soviet Air Force leadership assumed the P-38's escape was due to some technical advantage they did not possess, some secret American technology that allowed extreme dive performance. The possibility that the escape was due to one pilot's willingness to violate his own Air Force's restrictions, to experiment with prohibited techniques, to risk his life proving that doctrine was wrong. That possibility did not feature in Soviet analysis because it conflicted with how Soviet military culture understood the relationship between pilots and regulations. In Soviet doctrine, pilots executed approved procedures developed by headquarters planners. The idea that a pilot might ignore those procedures and develop his own techniques was not merely forbidden but conceptually foreign. The sound of those Allison engines at 500 miles per hour, shrieking at power levels and speeds that turned routine operation into mechanical violence, became the audible symbol of what separated Rooney's survival from his death. That sound was not weapon or armor or speed advantage in the conventional sense. It was the sound of willingness to enter conditions where control became theoretical, where doctrine stopped providing answers, where survival depended on individual judgment and experience rather than following established procedures. Soviet pilots pursuing him could not hear that sound, could not understand what it represented, could not know that the American fighter diving away from them was being piloted by someone who had decided that his own experimental understanding of what the aircraft could survive mattered more than what manuals said was safe. The difference between that sound at 400 miles per hour, still within established limits, still safe by official standards, and that sound at 500 miles per hour represented the difference between following orders and surviving, between respecting doctrine and achieving what doctrine said was impossible. And so we return to that crystalline November morning over Yugoslavia, to Captain Rooney at 18,000 feet, with 9 Soviet fighters climbing toward him, to the moment when all his practiced violations of procedure and all his forbidden experiments would either validate themselves or kill him. The recognition flares he carried would not be fired. The radio protocols would not be followed. The proper procedures would be abandoned in favor of improper techniques that his own commanders had ordered him never to use. The dive that followed, reaching speeds that turned control into negotiation and survival into probability rather than certainty, was not heroism in any conventional sense, but rather desperation refined through practice, terror managed through preparation, death avoided through willingness to risk a different death that happened to prove survivable. The 9 Soviet pilots who could not follow him into that dive were not inferior aviators, but rather products of a system that taught what headquarters approved rather than what experience discovered, that valued compliance over experimentation, that assumed doctrine would cover all situations and therefore discouraged the personal initiatives that might reveal doctrine's limitations. Rooney's impossible trick, mocked by squadron mates and prohibited by commanders, succeeded not because it was safe or approved, but because it was possible, and because one pilot had been willing to prove possibility by risking his life in experiments that everyone else said were suicidal. That willingness to question orders, to test limits, to develop personal expertise that conflicted with institutional wisdom, speaks to a fundamental truth about warfare and bureaucracy and the relationship between individual initiative and collective doctrine. Regulations exist for good reasons. Keep average pilots alive. Prevent the reckless from killing themselves through ignorance. But regulations also cannot cover all situations, cannot anticipate all threats, cannot substitute for judgment when theory meets reality and doctrine proves inadequate. The sound of those engines at 500 miles per hour. The shriek of metal and machinery pushed past design limits into realms where survival depends on understanding forces that manuals do not describe. Was the sound of individual judgment overriding institutional authority and proving through survival that sometimes the impossible is merely the unapproved.